Did you know that one mistake could cost millions of lives? In this story, the USA decided the fate of the war in just a few days. If you're interested in the truth about World War II, subscribe and hit the like button. There are many shocking facts ahead. Imagine this. The dawn of March 3rd, 1943, heavy with the sticky breath of the tropics. The sea around you is a sheet of dull silver, the horizon swallowed by a mist that clings like smoke. On the bridge of the Japanese destroyer Arashio, Captain Commander Hideo Kuboki narrows his eyes, peering into that ghostly haze. Beneath him, the deck is alive with frantic motion. Sailors, soaked in oil and seawater, struggle to drag half-dead survivors from the waves. They are men from the transport ship Kyokusei Maru, sent to the depths only the day before. This is Operation 81, the desperate attempt to deliver reinforcements to Lae New Guinea. The convoy has already suffered. One ship lost to the relentless American B-17s. Yet Kuboki allows himself a fragile hope. The worst, he believes, is over. Lae lies just hours ahead. Soon, the protective wings of Japanese fighters from shore will watch over them. But then, as the ship's clock creeps toward 10 a.m., a voice tears through the morning air. Sharp, terrified, final, aircraft! What Kuboki sees next will redefine everything he knows about war at sea. From the southwest, they come. Not the high-flying bombers of yesterday, those distant silhouettes that rained death from unreachable heights. No, these new attackers hug the sea itself, their propellers nearly slicing the water, their engines howling like predatory beasts. American B-25 Mitchells and Australian Beaufighters racing forward in a perfectly synchronized assault. A strike so bold, so low, that it will rewrite the future of naval warfare in the Pacific. In the heartbeat it takes for a skip bomb, armed with a 5-second fuse, to ricochet across the waves, Kuboki's world erupts. A blinding explosion, metal screams. His ship, the Arashio, is torn apart, steering destroyed, momentum dragging it helplessly into the transport Nojima Maru. The two ships collide in chaos, twisted steel against steel. Within 15 minutes, the sea becomes a graveyard. The once proud convoy is shattered. 7 transport ships, bearing 6,900 troops, now burning or sinking beneath the waves. 4 of the 8 destroyers are crippled or gone entirely. This is no mere naval skirmish. This is the birth of a new doctrine. Proof that skip bombing, a daring innovation born in secrecy by American tacticians, has forever changed the balance of power. No surface fleet will again feel safe within reach of land-based aircraft. But to understand how the Japanese captains came to face such annihilation, we must turn back 2 months earlier to January 1943. In Rabaul, the mighty fortress the Allies call the Gibraltar of the Pacific, Lieutenant General Hitoshi Imamura of the 8th Area Army wrestles with grim reality. The Allies have seized Buna after months of merciless combat, and now their gaze turns toward Lae and Salamaua. These are not just dots on a map. They are the linchpins of Japan's entire defense across the Southwest Pacific, the shield protecting Rabaul itself, where nearly 100,000 Japanese troops stand ready. If Lae falls, the road to the Philippines, even to Japan's home islands, will open wide. The logic of war here is pitiless. Every man, every bullet, every grain of rice must be ferried across the cruel waters of the Solomon and Bismarck Seas. Seas that will soon demand a terrible price. Would you have dared to command such a convoy, knowing what waited beyond the mist? Picture this. The distance between Rabaul and Lae is mere 500 miles on a chart, a number that lies comfortably on a map. Yet, in the cruel arithmetic of war, it feels like 5,000 miles. Why? Because Allied air power operating from Port Moresby and Milne Bay has grown teeth and bite. Previous attempts to thread the sea lanes have produced mixed, costly results. Recall January 7, 1943, a convoy carrying the 102nd Infantry Regiment, led by Major General Toru Okabe, reached Lae, but not unscathed. The transport Nichiryu Maru fell victim to an Australian Catalina flying boat, and with it went all of Okabe's medical supplies and 361 soldiers. Another ship, Miyoko Maru, was so grievously damaged that she was forced to beach. Can you imagine the scale of loss when a single hit swallows not only men but medicine and the fragile hope of recovery? Reinforcing New Guinea was fast becoming a debt the Japanese could scarcely afford. Lieutenant General Hitoshi Imamura understood the stakes with brutal clarity. Intelligence whispered of an Allied offensive. To hold Lae, he needed at least a full division. No half measures, no trickery. After fierce debate with his staff and naval commanders, a plan was forged. Operation 81, a concentrated convoy to deliver 6,900 troops of the 51st Division to Lae in one massive all-or-nothing push. The cost would be high. Even Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, warned losses might surpass 50%. Yet what choice remained? Landing men further along the coast and forcing a march through hostile jungle would likely bleed them to death, not only from bullets, but from disease, hunger, and constant Allied air attack. The decision was grim and absolute. The convoy would sail. At the helm of this vital enterprise stood Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura, commander of the 3rd Destroyer Squadron. At 54, Kimura was carved from experience, one of the Imperial Navy's most seasoned destroyer captains, forged in the night's savage ballet in the Solomons, where Japanese destroyers had repeatedly proved deadly. His force for Operation 81 was formidable, 8 veteran destroyers, all with scars and stories from Guadalcanal. Shirayuki, flying Kimura's flag, would lead. Alongside her sailed Asashio, Arashio, Tokitsukaze, Yukikaze, Shikinami, Uranami, and Asagumo, names that had long unnerved Allied sailors in nocturnal clashes. But pause and consider this. These were not the classic lightning raids Kimura had perfected. The swift destroyer dashes Americans dubbed the Tokyo Express. Those runs depended on speed, surprise, and night's cloak. Now, his sleek warships were tasked with shepherding 8 slow, exposed transports, lumbering under the weight of soldiers and supplies. The convoy's top speed, 7 knots, barely the pace of a brisk jog. For a commander who had cut through enemy seas at 30 knots, this felt like steering with an anchor streaming in the water. Every hour stretched the risk of sighting. Every daylight mile was a beacon for enemy aircraft. Meanwhile, 500 miles away in Port Moresby, a different kind of strategy was taking shape. Lieutenant General George Churchill Kenney, head of the 5th Air Force, had been haunted for months by a single problem. How do you reliably sink ships from the air? High-altitude bombing had proved almost impotent against nimble, moving targets. In the January convoy engagement, his bombers had flown 416 sorties and sank only 2 ships, a pathetically low yield, unacceptable even by the unforgiving standards of war. If Japanese convoys could keep supplying positions, General MacArthur's planned advance up the New Guinea coast risked bogging into a costly stalemate. Kenney was not given to conventional thinking. Before the war, as an instructor at the Air Corps Tactical School in 1928, he had sketched out a daring notion he called skip bombing. Release bombs at very low altitude so they would bounce across the water like stones and strike a ship's hull. At the time, his peers had dismissed it as reckless fantasy. But necessity has a way of making the impossible feel reasonable. Desperate to interdict Japanese shipping, Kenney chose to turn theory into practice. Making skip bombing work demanded meticulous experimentation. Major William Benn, commander of the 6th 3rd Bombardment Squadron, became Kenney's chief test pilot. Through repeated trials, they converged on a razor-edged envelope of parameters: approach at 200-250 feet altitude, fly at 200-250 miles per hour, release the bomb 300-600 yards from the target, and set a 4 or 5 second delay fuse. Too high, and the bomb fails to skip. Too low, and the attacking aircraft risks being consumed by its own explosion or shredded by debris. The margin for error was practically nil. Kenney also grasped a further truth. Skip bombing alone would not break the enemy's defenses. To survive the deadly curtain of anti-aircraft fire during low-level runs, the bombers needed firepower that suppressed, distracted, and destroyed concentrated flak. Enter Major Paul Irvin Pappy Gunn, a 43-year-old ex-Navy pilot turned mechanical innovator, Kenney's secret ace. Gunn, whose own family had been interned at Santa Thomas in Manila after the war's outbreak, carried a personal vendetta that fueled his inventiveness. He became the mechanic who could bend machines to audacity. Taking a standard B-25 Mitchell, he removed the bombardier's compartment from the nose and installed 4 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns. And he did not stop there. What followed next in this story of machines, men, and mechanics would change how aircraft fought ships. But that, as they say, is the next chapter. What would you have done poised between caution and the gamble of innovation? Imagine a bomber turned into a prowling gunship. Gun fits 2 more guns along each flank of the fuselage and another 4 under the belly, transforming the modified B-25 from a mere bomber into a forward-firing battering ram. Remember, he had already bolted 4 50-caliber machine guns into the nose. When Kenney first laid eyes on Gunn's creation, nicknamed Pappy's Folly, he saw not folly, but the shape of possibility. Strip everything out of the nose and fill it full of 50-caliber guns, he told Gunn. Put more along the sides. Give me every ounce of forward firepower you can. I want a skip bomber that will overwhelm a destroyer's deck defenses. Through February 1943, the converted B-25s put those ideas to the test, day after day, against the rusted hulk of the SS Pruth, a passenger ship that had run aground off Port Moresby in 1923. Picture the scene. Aircraft screaming in at mast height, tracers spitting, bombs skimming across the water like thrown stones and smashing into the stranded wreck. Their accuracy stunned the experimenters, a precision far superior to anything high-altitude bombing had produced. Yet practice on a stationary carcass is one thing. Facing a moving convoy, bristling with trained gunners and backed by fighter cover, was another matter entirely. Could these tactics survive the chaos of a real battle? Australia's role in this evolution was anything but incidental. No, 30 Squadron RAF flying Beaufighters had developed its own low-level anti-shipping methods. The Beaufighter, packing 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns, was tailor-made to pin down shipboard defenses. Group Captain Bill Gehring, an RRAF officer on Kenney's staff schooled in European anti-shipping operations, proposed a choreography of attack. Beaufighters would dive in first at mast height to suppress the flak with cannon and machine gun fire. Immediately after, the skip-bombing B-25s would come rushing in, and high above, B-17s would hammer from altitude, forcing the defenders to split their attention. A symphony of violence designed to confuse and overwhelm. Then, on February 14th, reconnaissance photographs from Rabaul Harbor detonated like bad news in Allied headquarters. 79 vessels were visible in port, including 45 merchant ships and 6 large transports. 2 days later, ultra intercepts, the secret art of reading Japanese coded traffic, delivered confirming detail. Codebreakers in Melbourne and Washington decrypted messages showing a convoy would sail from Rabaul on February 28th, bound for Lae with major reinforcements of the 51st Division, even spelling out the planned route and an estimated arrival of March 5th. For Kenney, this was the opening he had been waiting for, the chance to trial his innovations in a decisive strike. He summoned his commanders to Port Moresby and hammered out a plan of unprecedented scale. Brigadier General Ennis Whitehead, Kenney's deputy, and the commander of the advance echelon in New Guinea would coordinate the assault. The order of battle called for everything available: 90 heavy bombers, B-17 and B-24, 41 medium bombers, B-25s, 34 light bombers, A-20 Havocs, and 54 fighters, P-38 Lightnings and P-40 Warhawks, 2 I-19 aircraft in all, the largest coordinated strike yet seen in the Southwest Pacific. Excitement and nerves ran together among the pilots. "We're going to be sitting ducks coming in that low," muttered Lieutenant Charles Howe of the 3rd Attack Group. "One destroyer shell, and it's over." But Major Ed Larner, who would lead the skip-bombing wing, answered with the calm of rehearsal. "We've trained for this. Trust the plan. Go in fast, hit hard, and get out. The Beaufighters will clear the way." Back in Rabaul, the Japanese prepared with equal meticulousness. Each transport was combat-loaded, cargo stowed in reverse order of need to speed unloading at Lae. 5 battalion and 54 soldiers of the 51st Division's 115th Regiment boarded their assigned transports: Ayomaru, Kembumaru, Nojimamaru, Oikawamaru, Shin-Aimaru, Taimeimaru, and Teiomaru. An 8th vessel, Natsushima, carried aviation fuel and supplies desperately required by the air units at Lae. The destroyers themselves crammed in an additional 958 troops, every nook and hammock pressed into use. Among the human cargo were some of Japan's most senior commanders in New Guinea: Lieutenant General Hataso Adachi, commander of the 18th Army, climbed aboard Tokitsukaze. Lieutenant General Hidemitsu Nakano, commander of the 51st Division, embarked on Yukikaze with his full divisional staff. Why gather so much leadership in one convoy? Because the situation demanded both boldness and haste, confidence that the destroyers could shield them, and a desperation to place those leaders where they were most needed. Imagine a commander folding lessons into a plan like a sailor folding a chart. Careful, deliberate, and shaped by bitter experience, Admiral Masatomi Kimura does not take the shortest line across the Solomon Sea. He chooses instead a longer, cunning arc. Rather than risk the convoy to the maximum time under the enemy sky, he sends it north from Rabaul, then west along the shadowed north coast of New Britain, using the island's jagged mountain ridges as a living curtain to shield them from Allied radar and the most likely avenues of air attack. Only at the end does the route bite south, a perilous cut through the tight throat of Vityaz Strait, then a final, breathless sprint along the Huon Gulf coast toward Lae. That strait, a narrowing no wider than 50 miles at its smallest, will concentrate the convoy into a predictable lane, a funnel where vulnerability becomes almost a physical law. Kimura secures a promise of air cover. 100 fighters from the Navy and Army Air Forces at Rabaul will patrol on rotation. But promises in war have limits. The distance from Rabaul to the strait pushes Japanese fighters to the edge of their range. They can only cling to the convoy for brief, precious minutes before returning to refuel. Worse, months of continuous combat have hollowed out the force. Pilots fatigued, aircraft worn, spare parts running to desperation. The hard truth is this: the convoy will be sheltered only in patches, islands of protection in a sea of exposure. On the night of February 28, 1943, as tropical night settles over Simpson Harbor, the convoy slips away. One by one, the transports ease from the wharves, decks thick with soldiers taking last long looks at Rabaul's lights. Destroyers wheel and circle like guardians, cruise at their stations even in friendly waters. Submarine attacks near base were not unheard of. Rear Admiral Kimura, standing on Shirayuki's bridge, watches his charges form into two columns, destroyers on the flanks and leading the way. At midnight, he gives the order, 7 knots, course 350 degrees, and the convoy slides into the Bismarck Sea's black throat. For a day, the sea keeps its counsel. The sailors' sworn enemy, weather, becomes their ally as two tropical storms sweep across the Solomon and Bismarck Seas, wrapping the convoy in low clouds and rain squalls that hide them from Allied eyes. Seasick men sigh with guarded relief as each hour passes unseen. Yet Kimura knows the reprieve is borrowed time. Tomorrow the clouds will thin, and with clear sky comes the American bomber. His worry proves prescient. At 3 p.m. on March 1st, as the convoy rounds Cape Gloucester at New Britain's western tip and turns south toward WWII Strait, the clouds open like curtains. At that exact moment, a B-24 Liberator of the 91st Bombardment Group, piloted by Lieutenant Walter Higgins, drifts overhead on reconnaissance. Higgins counts what intelligence had hinted at: 8 transports, 8 destroyers, exactly where they should be. He radios the contact that will set in motion one of the Pacific War's most decisive air-sea clashes. Back at 5th Air Force Headquarters in Port Moresby, the report electrifies the room. General George Churchill. Kenney orders the attack to proceed, but a complication appears. The convoy has been sighted earlier than planned and remains north of the WWII Strait, a position where Japanese fighters from New Britain can more readily intercept. Brigadier General Ennis Whitehead makes the call: initiate with conventional high-altitude bombing to damage and slow the convoy now. Hold the decisive skip bombing strike until the ships funnel into the tighter confines of the strait tomorrow, where maneuver will be restricted. Morning of March 2nd brings clearer weather, and with it, the first American blow. 28 B-17 Flying Fortresses mount an attack from 6,500 feet, maintaining formation even as roughly 30 Japanese fighters climb to intercept. The transport captains, many civilian mariners pulled into the Navy's grip, watch in a dumbfounded mix of horror and grim fascination as 4-engine bombers pour their loads. Water geysers erupt around the convoy as most bombs miss, but war is often cruel arithmetic. Enough find their mark. The transport Kyokusei Maru takes a direct hit, breaks in two, and sinks within minutes. Another transport is struck and begins to fall astern. Captain Sato Yasuo, commanding the destroyer Asashio and leading Destroyer Division 8, swings immediately to rescue. His crew hauls nearly 700 soldiers and sailors from oil-slick water, packing them into every inch of available deck space. Noble, humane, and tactically costly. Asashio, now dangerously overloaded, loses mobility and fighting effectiveness under the weight of survivors. As night drapes across March 2nd, Rear Admiral Kimura confronts a wrenching choice. The convoy remains some 12 hours from Lae, but one transport is gone and others crippled. Should he press on at slow speed with the damaged ships, preserving unity but lengthening exposure, or should the faster destroyers dash ahead, splitting the formation to get at least part of the force to Lae sooner? Kimura decides on cohesion. Maintain formation. Proceed together. He signals every ship. Maintain formation. We proceed to Lae together. Unseen by Kimura, that order is intercepted and read. Allied code breakers have already unraveled the convoy's movements. Kenney and Whitehead now know precisely where the convoy will be at dawn. Its speed, its formation, its vulnerability. The stage is set. That night, Allied strike crews huddle for final briefings, the air thick with a tense mixture of anticipation and dread. What would you have done in Kimura's place? Cling to unity and risk everything, or gamble on splitting to save part of the force? Feel the air tighten. That restless, metallic hush pilots know before everything starts moving. Crews double-check guns, mechanics run fingers over trim tabs, and men write hurried letters home, folding words into envelopes that may never be delivered. Would you have written one, knowing tomorrow you would fly so low that a single burst from a destroyer's gun could end it all? Dawn on March 3, 1943, breaks like polished glass over the Bismarck Sea. The sky is flawless, perfect flying weather, and for the Japanese convoy now threading the confined approach to the Huon Gulf, the worst possible gift. The transports hug their 7-knot crawl toward Lae, hours away. The survivors have closed ranks. Destroyers wheel and circle like sheepdogs around a panicked flock. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura has ordered iron discipline. No AA round fired unless he says so. Conserve the flares of life for the storm he knows is coming. At 10 a.m. that storm arrives, but not as the convoy expects. First, 13 RAF Beaufighters of No. 30 Squadron, led by Squadron Leader Claude Ridley, drop from the horizon at wave-top height. So low their prop wash scrapes the sea. Behind them, black specks grow into the B-25s of the 3rd Attack Group. On Arashio's bridge, Commander Hideo Kuboki has mere breaths to read the sky and decide. What does a captain do when everything he trusted about air attack is suddenly wrong? How do you fight a threat that lives at the waterline? The Beaufighters answer first, with brutal, concentrated violence. Their 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns spit fire that rakes Arashio's decks. Cannon rounds bloom among the AA crews, killing or maiming gunners before they can find elevation. Machine gun bursts shred bridge windows, cut down signalmen, and turn disciplined topside teams into broken figures diving for cover. In seconds, Arashio's defensive heart is shot through. Her ability to fire back is critically eroded. That was the curtain raiser. Right on its heels come the B-25s, each laden with 2 500-pound bombs fitted with 5-second delay fuses, noses bristling with forward guns. Major Ed Larner leads the formation. His modified bomber, Betty's Dream, comes screaming at 220 miles per hour, only 50 feet above the swell. Through his sight, Larner sees sailors scrambling for guns and shelter. At 300 yards, he lets the bombs go and yanks up, clearing the destroyer's mast by inches. The bombs skip 1, 2, and then slam into Shirayuki's hull just below the waterline. The result is apocalyptic. The thin skin of a destroyer gives way. The bombs punch in, detonate within narrow compartments, and their blast is multiplied by confined steel and timber. Shirayuki's stern is virtually ripped off. A rear magazine blows in a cataclysm that hurls wreckage and men high into the air. In minutes, Admiral Kimura's flagship is going down, a patch of black oil and flame. Kimura, struck by shrapnel, is hauled from the sea by Shikanami, but the flagship's loss is total and terrible. The attack unfolds with a terrible choreographed beauty as Beaufighters and B-25s scream at mast height. B-17s of the 43rd Bombardment Group pound from above at some 7,000 feet, their bombs raining to add confusion and carnage. Anti-aircraft crews, those still able to fight, confront a damn choice: engage the close, lethal attackers ripping at their decks, or try to disturb the aim of the high flyers. Most opt for the immediate peril, filling the sky with tracers and bursting shells. Still, the B-25s are simply too fast and too low to be stopped effectively. Into that maelstrom, Lieutenant Charles Howe, flying his B-25 chatterbox, picks out his mark, the transport Teomaru. What he and his comrades could not know then was how profoundly this single, devastating tactic would alter naval warfare. But in those frantic seconds, all decisions were immediate, brutal, and irreversible. What would you have done looking down over a sea of smoke and men with the choice to strike or to pull away? The Reckoning. March 4th, 1943. By dawn, the Bismarck Sea is no longer a battlefield, but a graveyard. Oil slicks glisten across miles of ocean, littered with wreckage, lifeboats, and the desperate shapes of men clinging to anything that floats. American PT boats and aircraft sweep the area relentlessly, hunting for movement on the water. The official order is clear: prevent any Japanese survivors from reaching shore and reinforcing Lae. But in the cockpits and on the decks, many Allied airmen feel the weight of something darker. They had come to fight ships, not drowning men. Several pilots later admit to turning away rather than firing again. Others obey orders mechanically, numb, unable to reconcile duty with the sight of helpless sailors waving white cloths amid burning oil. The clean lines between combat and slaughter blur in the heat haze over the sea. What had begun as a test of innovation and courage now transforms into a lesson in the moral cost of total war. A lesson that will follow these men long after the guns fall silent. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea marks more than just a defeat. It signals the end of an era. Admiral Matome Ugaki, Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet, writes bitterly in his diary, "We have lost the ability to move freely within range of enemy land-based aircraft. The convoy system, once the backbone of our strategy, is no longer viable." It is a quiet acknowledgement of revolution, not political, but tactical. Never again will Japan risk daylight convoys in contested waters. From now on, only submarines and fast destroyers will attempt supply runs under cover of darkness. The desperate rat runs, a lifeline already fraying. Meanwhile, for the Allies, the success of skip bombing changes everything. What began as General George Kenney's gamble and Major Pappy Gunn's mechanical experiment now becomes doctrine. Across the Pacific, from the Solomons to the Philippines, air crews are trained to strike ships at wave height. Their aircraft turned into precision instruments of annihilation. Sea control has passed from the fleets to the air. The oceans themselves no longer safe for any enemy vessel. For Pappy Gunn, whose wife and children remain imprisoned in the Philippines, each burning ship feels like both revenge and progress. His jury-rigged B-25 gunship, once dismissed as Pappy's folly, is now the template for a new generation of purpose-built attack bombers. North American aviation begins adding his designs to production models: reinforced noses, heavier forward armament, gunner protection. Gunn keeps pushing, driven by equal parts genius and grief, turning metal into salvation. Yet even victory carries its own weight. The consequences of the Bismarck Sea echo through the Japanese command chain. On March 25, 1943, Imperial Headquarters orders a shift in strategy. The defense of New Guinea will now take precedence over the Solomon Islands. But the directive is hollow. Without convoys, without supply, the garrisons at Lae, Salamaua, and along the coast are already cut off, condemned to die where they stand. Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi, who miraculously survives the sinking of Tokitsukaze, reaches Lae with fewer than 1,200 men, less than a fifth of the 6,900 who left Rabaul. His first message back to headquarters is stark. The situation is beyond recovery by normal means. He is right. Within 6 months, Lae falls, and the long retreat of Japan in the Southwest Pacific begins. The stories that trickle back from survivors are fragments of horror and endurance. One soldier from the 51st Division recalls 3 days adrift on debris, surrounded by corpses, watching sharks feed. Of 12 men on the same raft, only 3 lived. Others died not from wounds, but from exhaustion or simply letting go. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura, wounded but alive, faces no reprimand. Everyone in the high command understands he fought an unwinnable battle against a weapon they had not yet learned to fear. But Kimura never again leads ships into action. There's something inside him. That fierce, unbending confidence of a destroyer captain is gone. He spends the rest of the war behind a desk, haunted by the images of his convoy's destruction, by the screams that rose from the water as fire closed in. For the American airmen, the Bismarck Sea becomes legend and burden. Major Ed Larner receives the Distinguished Service Cross for his leadership in the Skip bombing strike, his name written into Air Force history. But in quiet letters home, the tone changes. Lieutenant Charles Howe, pilot of Chatterbox, writes to his wife, "We destroyed them completely. It was necessary, I know, but I can't forget the sight of all those men in the water. This isn't the kind of war I thought I'd be fighting." It is the eternal refrain of modern warfare. Victory measured in annihilation, heroism shadowed by doubt. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea ends not just a convoy or a campaign, but the illusion that war could still be fought cleanly. The triumph and the truth. March 1943 and beyond. General Douglas MacArthur, ever conscious of image and theater, wastes no time seizing the narrative. Within hours of the last bomb falling, his headquarters releases a triumphant communiqué to the world's press. 22 enemy ships destroyed, 15,000 Japanese troops annihilated in one of the most decisive air battles of the war. It is vintage MacArthur, dramatic, defiant, and only loosely connected to reality. In truth, the Japanese losses are 8 transports, 4 destroyers, and about 3,000 men. But the accuracy of the figures is beside the point. The victory is total. The symbolism, irresistible. For a public still haunted by Pearl Harbor, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea offers emotional redemption, proof that the tide of war has turned. Newspapers print breathless headlines. Newsreels play footage of blazing ships and cheering pilots. MacArthur, with his familiar corncob pipe and tailored khakis, becomes the face of American resurgence in the Pacific. Yet, beneath the headlines, the story is more complicated. For the Australians who flew and fought alongside their American allies, the triumph carries a quieter, deeper significance. The men of No. 30 Squadron, RAIF, who dove through curtains of tracer fire in their Bristol Beaufighters, finally have proof that their small, resourceful Air Force can stand with the best. Without their precision attacks suppressing Japanese gunners, the American skip bombers would never have made their runs. Squadron leader Claude Ridley, awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, later summed up the unease many felt. It wasn't a fight, it was an execution. His words capture the moral unease that hangs over the victory, the knowledge that airmen flying at 200 miles an hour had become both executioners and witnesses to the mechanized death of thousands. In Tokyo, the aftermath is bitter and divisive. The Japanese Army and Navy, long at odds, now turn their fury on each other. Army generals accuse the Navy of failing to provide adequate air cover or carrier support. Admirals retort that the Army's insistence on daylight convoys was suicidal. The recriminations deepen the rift that has crippled Japan's war effort since before Pearl Harbor. While the Americans innovate, adapting their tactics within weeks, Japanese staff officers argue over blame. No unified doctrine emerges. No effective counter to skip bombing is ever found. The consequences ripple far beyond the Bismarck Sea. Strategically, the battle proves that air power alone, properly trained, properly armed, and properly coordinated, can dominate sea lanes once ruled by surface fleets. The lesson is unmistakable. The age of the battleship is over. The implications are staggering. For nations built on maritime power, Japan, Britain, even the United States itself, the sea is no longer a sanctuary. Aircraft have extended the reach of war far beyond the horizon. The sky, not the ocean, is now the true battlefield. In the months that follow, Allied engineers refine every aspect of the new art of ship killing. Skip bombing sights are calibrated for precision at 50 feet. Delay fuses are redesigned for reliability. Pilots are retrained to approach at mast height, weave through anti-aircraft fire, and coordinate in multi-angle attacks. Soon, new weapons join the arsenal. Air-launched rockets, heavier bombs, and forward-firing gunships purpose-built for low-level strikes. The Japanese scramble to respond. They experiment with barrage balloons, smoke screens, and special anti-aircraft shells designed to burst at sea level. But these are stopgaps against a tidal wave. The skies have turned against them, and no amount of improvisation can restore their lost freedom of movement. Amid the grand shifts of doctrine and technology, the human cost fades from official reports, but not from private memory. In distant Japanese towns, mothers and wives wait for letters that never come. Casualty lists are censored, softened, made abstract. Mrs. Yamada, whose husband sailed aboard the Teomaru, receives a single line from the Ministry of War. He died gloriously for the Emperor in the South Seas. She will never know the truth, that he died trapped below deck as bombs skipped across the sea and tore the ship apart, that the waters burned, that few survived long enough to even scream. Her ignorance is a mercy, though it is not peace. For the Allied code breakers who read the Japanese naval signals, quiet men and women hunched over cipher tables in Melbourne, Washington, and Honolulu, the battle is their vindication. Their decrypted messages gave Kenney and MacArthur perfect foreknowledge, the convoy's route, speed, and destination. Without Ultra, the ambush might never have been possible, but their triumph, too, is secret. Their success must remain hidden, their contribution unacknowledged, lest the enemy realize their codes are broken. And so, in public, the credit belongs to the pilots and the generals. In private, the code breakers know that the war has entered a new age, one of invisible warfare, fought in numbers, signals, and silence. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea is over, but its lessons shape everything that follows. The balance of power in the Pacific has shifted irrevocably. Japan will never again attempt a major daylight convoy. The Allies, emboldened and evolving, will carry the fight up the coast of New Guinea, across the Philippines, and finally to the shores of Japan itself. What began as a desperate experiment in a remote corner of the South Pacific has become a revolution, one born not only of courage and invention, but of necessity, fear, and the hard, unforgiving mathematics of modern war. the legacy of the Bismarck Sea, innovation, triumph, and the cost of victory. But every triumph carries its shadow. Behind the headlines and the parades, a different battle begins, one fought not with bombs and bullets, but with secrecy and deception. Allied commanders understand the peril. If the Japanese ever realize their naval codes are compromised, they will change them, plunging Allied intelligence back into darkness, and so the story of the Bismarck Sea must be rewritten. Official communiques attribute the ambush to brilliant reconnaissance and daring aerial pursuit, not to the quiet miracle of broken ciphers. The code breakers' greatest victory must remain invisible, their contribution buried beneath the myth of chance discovery. The propaganda war that follows is almost as fierce as the battle itself. Tokyo Radio insists that the convoy reached its destination safely, that American reports of destruction are absurd exaggerations concocted to raise enemy morale. But in the steaming jungles of Lae, the truth cannot be hidden. The soldiers there see the wreckage washing ashore, the handful of survivors who stumble in, eyes hollow and uniforms in tatters. They understand what the official communiques will never admit. The empire has lost its reach. Reinforcements will not come. They are alone. In Washington and Canberra, the tone is very different. The victory is hailed as proof that the Pacific tide has turned, that MacArthur's grand vision for advancing through New Guinea is not only possible, but inevitable. Political skeptics who once dismissed his plans now rally behind him. Funds, aircraft, and manpower flow into the Southwest Pacific Command. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea has become more than a triumph of arms. It is a validation of strategy, a hinge upon which the next phase of the war will turn. Few at the time give thought to what lies beneath those waters. Thousands of tons of oil bleed from ruptured hulls, spreading black veins across the Bismarck Sea, poisoning reefs and beaches for miles. The wrecks, once proud ships of the Imperial Japanese Navy, settle quietly into the depths, their holds still packed with trucks, ammunition, and human remains. Today, sonar surveys reveal them sitting upright on the seabed, eerily intact, underwater museums of steel and sacrifice. For historians, the battle becomes a case study, a turning point in the evolution of modern warfare. It is dissected in war colleges and staff schools, cited as proof of the power of intelligence, innovation, and joint operations. The conclusions are clear. Without air superiority, surface fleets are helpless. Without innovation, superiority itself is temporary. Yet amidst the theories and diagrams, the human element remains. There is courage on both sides. Japanese destroyer captains steering their ships into the path of attacking bombers, knowing they would die. Allied pilots pressing their attacks through walls of flak, their cockpits shuddering with each near miss. Sailors, Japanese and American alike, reaching out across the water to pull strangers from the burning sea. In that moment, stripped of uniform and flag, humanity flickers through the smoke. As the war grinds on, the veterans scatter across the Pacific. Some continue fighting over Bougainville, Biak, and the Philippines. Others return home to train new squadrons, teaching young pilots how to fly low, to skip bombs true, to survive. A few, shattered by the strain of combat, are sent home in silence. Their bodies heal. Their minds often do not. General George Kenney rises to command all Allied air forces in the Pacific. But when he later writes his memoirs, it is the Bismarck Sea he remembers most. "We changed the nature of war that day," he writes. Ships could no longer operate within range of land-based aircraft unless they controlled the air above them. It was a lesson written in blood, but one that had to be learned. For Japan, the lesson comes at a price they can never repay. The loss of a full division's worth of men and material cripples their campaign in New Guinea. Within a year, most of their garrisons are destroyed or cut off, starving, diseased, abandoned. The dream of a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere dissolves in oil and smoke. Yet even as Japan's empire collapses, the technological seeds planted in the Bismarck Sea begin to bloom. The principle of skip bombing, low-altitude, high-speed attack, evolves into the doctrine behind modern anti-ship missiles. The B-25 gunships of 1943 are the ancestors of today's maritime strike aircraft. Still flying low, still striking fast, the battle's legacy lives not just in history books, but in the circuitry of modern warfare. And yet, beyond technology and tactics lies a more haunting inheritance: the moral reckoning. The strafing of survivors, whether justified by military logic or condemned by conscience, forces a question that lingers long after the war ends. Where does necessity end and humanity begin? Can victory ever be pure when it is bought at such a cost? These questions, first whispered by pilots and whispered still by historians, never find simple answers. They echo in classrooms, in military tribunals, in the restless dreams of those who were there. For the survivors, the battle never truly ends. Decades later, Japanese veterans wake sweating from dreams of B-25s, hurtling toward them at wave-top height. American airmen still see faces in the water. Australian Beaufighter crews remember the sound, the metallic scream of cannon shells biting into steel and flesh. Time dulls memory, but not guilt. Strategically, the victory accelerates the Allied advance. With Japanese convoys crippled, their garrison starved, and the island-hopping campaign surges forward. Each leap across the Pacific costs fewer Allied lives, a grim arithmetic that defines the logic of total war. In military academies, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea becomes the textbook example of what future theorists will call effects-based operations, the precise application of intelligence, technology, and timing to achieve disproportionate results. A smaller force, wielded with innovation and coordination, defeats a larger one. But outside the lecture halls, the sea remembers. Today, fishermen cast their nets where bombers once flew. Coral has grown over rusted decks, and the bones of sailors rest undisturbed beneath layers of silt. The water is calm again, deceptively so. For those who know its history, who understand what happened here on March 3, 1943, the Bismarck Sea is more than ocean. It is a mirror reflecting courage and cruelty, brilliance and horror, progress and loss. It reminds us that every innovation in war carries a debt, that behind every triumph lies a reckoning, one measured not in ships sunk or missions flown, but in the uncounted cost of human souls. Echoes across time, the enduring lessons of the Bismarck Sea. It is a lesson that still resonates today, in an age ruled by precision weapons, drones, and shrinking defense budgets. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea, though fought more than 80 years ago, refuses to fade quietly into the past. Its consequences ripple outward, not just through military history, but through the environment, culture, and collective memory of the nations it touched. Beneath the calm waters of the Bismarck Sea, the wrecks endure, ghostly silhouettes of steel slowly surrendering to rust and coral. Yet their decay carries danger. Oil and chemicals leak from ruptured tanks, poisoning the fragile marine ecosystem. Unexploded bombs still lurk on the seabed, silent threats to fishermen and divers. Illegal salvagers, chasing wartime metal for profit, strip the wrecks bare, desecrating what should be solemn war graves. The battle, in a sense, continues to claim lives long after the last veteran has fallen silent. How do we remember such a battle? The answer depends on where you ask. In Australia, the Bismarck Sea is celebrated as the moment when the RAF stood shoulder to shoulder with the greatest air forces on Earth, a vindication of skill, courage, and ingenuity. In the United States, it sits in the shadow of larger, more famous victories: Midway, the Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf. In Japan, it has all but vanished from public consciousness. One more entry in a long list of wartime catastrophes buried beneath the ashes of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Each version of remembrance reveals as much about national identity as it does about history itself. And yet, behind every version lies the same truth. The victory would not have been possible without information. The ultra-code breakers, the coast watchers hidden on jungle ridges, the reconnaissance pilots who risked their lives to track the convoy, together they turned knowledge into power. The battle proved that in modern warfare, information is as lethal as firepower. To know where the enemy is, to anticipate their movements, is to hold the key to victory. But the human story extends far beyond the pilots and sailors. For the indigenous peoples of New Guinea and the surrounding islands, the battle brought a collision of worlds. To them, the skies that once carried monsoon rains now thundered with engines and fire. Wreckage washed ashore, scattering the beaches with strange metals and weapons, as some found opportunity, scavenging tools, fuel, and supplies from the debris. Others faced tragedy, their fishing grounds ruined, their villages scarred by the violence of empires not their own. Their voices, seldom recorded, form the unspoken chorus of this history. 80 years on, what lessons remain? Perhaps the most sobering is that every innovation in warfare, no matter how ingenious, is ultimately a refinement of destruction. Skip bombing, that brilliant fusion of physics, daring, and improvisation, was at its core a more efficient way to kill. The modified B-25 gunships were marvels of engineering, but their purpose was singular: to annihilate. And yet context matters. The Allied crews who developed and employed these tactics were not monsters, but men fighting a ruthless enemy who had brought war to every shore of the Pacific. The soldiers aboard those Japanese transports were not innocent victims, but instruments of aggression. The moral clarity of the Second World War, rare in human conflict, gives some measure of justification to the terrible efficiency of that victory. Still, the Bismarck Sea reminds us that adaptation determines survival. Both sides entered the Pacific War chained to outdated visions of naval combat, battleships trading broadsides beneath a rising sun. But war had changed. The sea no longer belonged to ships, it belonged to the sky. Those who adapted, like General Kenney and his daring airmen, reshaped warfare itself. Those who clung to tradition, like the Japanese convoy commanders, paid in lives and steel for their refusal to evolve. For modern strategists, this is not ancient history, but a warning written in wreckage. Technological advantage is fleeting. The innovations that dominate one decade can become obsolete the next. The commanders who assume superiority without adaptation invite disaster. In an age of cyber warfare, artificial intelligence, and autonomous weapons, the lesson of the Bismarck Sea is as urgent as ever. The side that learns faster, that bends first, survives. And through all of it, amid the maps, metrics, and theories, we must not forget the human element. Each of the 3,000 Japanese soldiers who died in that sea had a name, a home, someone who waited for their return. Each Allied airman who flew through tracer fire had friends, fears, and a heartbeat racing beneath his flight suit. When we speak of losses or victories, we are speaking of lives, the raw material of history. As the last veterans pass away, their voices fade into archives and recordings, leaving us with only photographs, diaries, and the cold precision of data. The danger is that the Battle of the Bismarck Sea becomes just another diagram in a textbook, arrows on a map, statistics in a lecture. We must resist that temptation. History is not made by numbers, but by choices, by men and women forced to decide, in moments of terror and doubt, what kind of people they will be. The influence of this battle did not end with the war. The doctrines forged in those skies over the Bismarck Sea shaped the post-war world, guiding the design of aircraft, the strategy of navies, and the philosophy of modern air power. Echoes across time. The final reckoning of the Bismarck Sea. The story does not end with the last explosion fading over the Bismarck Sea. In truth, that moment marked a beginning, a new era in the evolution of warfare. The triumph of skip bombing ignited a revolution that still shapes our world. From those low-flying B-25s skimming the waves came the lineage of every modern maritime strike aircraft, every guided missile that hunts ships across the oceans today. The vulnerability of surface fleets laid bare in 1943 compelled nations to forge new shields, radar networks, proximity fuses, surface-to-air missiles, each one an answer to the lesson first written in fire over the Bismarck Sea. The eternal duel between sword and shield, between air and sea, began there and has never truly ended. Each nation drew its own conclusions from the battle's outcome, weaving it into the fabric of its military identity. For the United States Air Force, it became a cornerstone, a testament to the power of independent air operations, proof that aircraft alone could turn the tide of war. The Royal Australian Air Force embraced it as vindication of its courage and skill, a moment when its pilots stood as equals among global powers. For Japan's post-war maritime self-defense force, the battle endures as a somber warning. Without command of the air, even the mightiest fleet is a target waiting to be found. These divergent interpretations are more than historical curiosities. They shape how modern militaries train, plan, and imagine the wars of tomorrow. Yet, beneath the strategic lessons lies a quieter, darker question, one of morality. The Allied air crews who strafed survivors in the water faced a dilemma that remains painful even now. Was it necessity to prevent enemy troops from reaching New Guinea and killing again? Or was it something else? The moment when necessity blurred into cruelty. The deliberate sinking of transport ships packed with soldiers, most unable to fight back, forces us to confront the uneasy boundary between legitimate military action and atrocity. In that sense, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea was not only a test of tactics, but a test of conscience, a test humanity continues to face as weapons grow ever more precise and impersonal. In the vast chronicle of the Pacific War, the Bismarck Sea stands as a decisive turning point, the moment when the Allied forces seized the initiative for good. After this, Japan's empire no longer advanced. It retreated, step by step, island by island. The psychological shift was immense. For the Allies, it was proof that the seemingly invincible Japanese war machine could be destroyed. For Japan, it was a wound that cut deep into morale, a revelation that no amount of willpower could protect steel and flesh from the relentless reach of Allied air power. From that day forward, the question was no longer if Japan would lose, but how long it would take and at what cost. The battle's success also illuminated the power of unity in war. American and Australian forces, once separate in method and command, fused their efforts in a harmony of strategy and execution. Airmen, sailors, and intelligence officers worked as one, a living demonstration of joint operations at their most effective. Today's doctrines of integrated warfare, where information, air, land, and sea act in concert, trace their lineage to this very moment over the Bismarck Sea. For those who study the art and science of war, the lessons remain vivid. Intelligence, the ability to anticipate the enemy's movements, is as vital as courage. Innovation, even when born from desperation, can overturn entire doctrines. Air superiority is the decisive element of modern combat, and surface ships, magnificent as they are, remain perilously exposed without it. These truths were paid for in lives and wreckage in 1943, and they echo still across every new battlefield, from the South China Sea to the skies over Ukraine. Yet amid the analysis and strategy, the most enduring lesson of all is human. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea revealed both the heights of human ingenuity and the depths of human suffering. It showed that creativity, courage, and adaptability, our finest traits, can serve the machinery of destruction as easily as the pursuit of peace. It proved that triumph and tragedy can be one and the same event, viewed from opposite sides of history. In those few heartbeats, when bombs skipped across the waves and struck with 5-second fuses, the world crossed a threshold. Naval warfare would never again belong solely to ships and admirals. The sky had claimed the sea. From that moment onward, dominance would belong not to those who floated, but to those who flew and to those who learned. Today, as new powers rise and tensions once again simmer in the same Pacific waters, the ghosts of the Bismarck Sea whisper their warning. Innovation without reflection leads to devastation. Power without wisdom courts ruin. The lessons of 1943, air superiority, intelligence, adaptation, are still etched upon the surface of the ocean, waiting for us to read them. To remember the Battle of the Bismarck Sea is to honor all who were part of it, victor and vanquished alike. It is to acknowledge their courage, to mourn their loss, and to learn from their choices. Above all, it is to accept the truth that every war, however necessary, carries within it both triumph and tragedy. And that truth, like the rusting ships beneath the waves, endures, silent, solemn, and eternal. Epilogue: the legacy of the Bismarck Sea. The innovation and courage displayed at the Battle of the Bismarck Sea deserve our admiration, but the death and destruction that accompanied them should deepen our determination to find better ways to resolve conflict. From Rear Admiral Kimura's doomed convoy to General Kenney's daring airmen, from the courage of individual pilots and sailors to the tragedy of thousands lost beneath the waves, this story is ultimately a human one. It reminds us that behind every military innovation, every tactical victory, and every strategic calculation are men and women whose lives are forever changed. In those few seconds when Japanese captains had to react, in those 15 minutes when an entire convoy was consumed by fire and chaos, entire worlds ended and history itself shifted course. That is the true legacy of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. Not merely the lessons of strategy or the triumph of innovation, but the enduring reminder that war, for all its necessity and heroism, is the most serious of human endeavors. It demands our best qualities while revealing our capacity for destruction. As we face an uncertain future, the battle's lessons about adaptation, ingenuity, and the human cost of conflict remain as urgent today as they were on that clear March morning in 1943, when skip-bombing B-25s swept in at wave-top height and changed the nature of warfare forever. The men who fought and died in the Bismarck Sea, Japanese and Allied alike, soldiers and sailors, airmen and Marines, deserve to be remembered not as statistics, but as individuals caught in a moment that reshaped the world. Their sacrifice, whether chosen or compelled, whether ending in victory or in loss, helped to shape the freedoms and security we now take for granted. We owe them more than remembrance. We owe them understanding and a commitment to build a future where such sacrifices are no longer required. As the sun sets over the Bismarck Sea today, its waters calm and radiant, it is difficult to imagine the violence that once tore through this tranquil expanse. Yet beneath those waters lie the rusting hulls of ships and the remains of men, silent witnesses to one of the Pacific War's most decisive battles. They remind us that the peace we enjoy was purchased at terrible cost, and that we bear a lasting obligation to use it wisely. This, then, is the story of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, a story of innovation and destruction, courage and terror, victory and tragedy. It deserves to be told not because war is glorious, but because only by confronting our past in all its complexity can we hope to navigate our future. The mere seconds that Japanese captains had to respond to the oncoming B-25s may seem like a small detail in the vast narrative of World War II, yet in those seconds, the course of the Pacific War was decided and thousands of lives were sealed to their fate